In the arid plains of Persia, under the burning sun and vast sky that had witnessed empires rise and crumble, a child was born into greatness. Cambyses, the son of Cyrus the Great and Queen Casandane, came into the world around 558 BCE, not as a common prince, but as the heir to a nascent empire that would one day stretch from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. His birth was not just a moment of joy within the Achaemenid royal house. It was the extension of a vision, a legacy set in motion by his father's conquests, diplomacy, and political genius. Cyrus the Great was already a legend in his own time. From humble beginnings as a Persian tribal leader, he had defied the Median Empire, subjugated Lydia, and overthrown the Babylonian kings, all while crafting a reputation for fairness and tolerance that would echo through the centuries. His rule established not just an empire but a model for governance, a diverse, multi-ethnic state bound not only by force but by cooperation. In such a context, the birth of a male heir was more than a dynastic necessity. It was symbolic continuity. Cambyses was not just a son. He was a vessel through which the dream of a global Persian dominion could survive beyond its founder. Yet the gift of birthright came with a silent weight. From his earliest memories, Cambyses would have known he was not like other children. His tutors were the most learned men of Persia, scholars from Elam, priests from Zoroastrian temples, administrators from Babylon, and soldiers seasoned in the harshest frontiers. He learned the cuneiform scripts of multiple languages, the laws of Hammurabi, the philosophies of Zoroaster, and the strategies of empire that had guided his father's footsteps. But most of all, he learned what it meant to live in a shadow, a long, wide, and indomitable shadow cast by Cyrus the Great. Casandane, his mother, was no ordinary queen. A noblewoman of the Achaemenid line herself, she had strength of mind and a spiritual depth that left a lasting mark on her children. Though historical records on her are few and sparse, one detail stands out. When she died, Cyrus commanded mourning throughout the empire. That act alone, among the countless strategic decisions of Cyrus's reign, revealed the emotional and political significance of the queen. She had given him not only a son but a compass, an anchor of cultural and ethical grounding that was not easily replaced. In her presence, Cambyses found softness to balance his stern instructors. She whispered to him not of conquest but of duty, not of domination but of harmony. Her stories were filled with the deeds of ancient kings, but also the dangers of pride and the need for measured rule. Her death, likely when Cambyses was still a youth, was his first true encounter with impermanence, a foreshadowing of how swiftly pillars of strength could vanish. As he grew, so too did the empire. With every new province added to the Persian dominion, Bactria in the east, the Greek cities of Asia Minor in the west, Cambyses watched his father not only as a ruler but as a symbol. Cyrus did not merely command armies. He inspired civilizations. He rebuilt temples in Babylon, protected the religious freedoms of conquered peoples, and developed the first known declarations of human rights. In such a world, Cambyses was taught that strength must be tempered by wisdom, that force must always wear the mask of justice. But whether Cambyses absorbed this message fully, or simply echoed it to satisfy expectations, remains a question historians still ponder. When Cambyses reached adolescence, he was drawn into the machinery of empire. His early roles were ceremonial, standing beside his father at diplomatic ceremonies, delivering royal proclamations in satrapal courts, reviewing military drills. Yet these duties were not merely for show. They were the crucible through which the future king was molded. He visited Babylon's ziggurats, watched the harvests of Egypt arrive at Persian ports, and witnessed the negotiation of treaties between feuding tribes. To the common people of the empire, he was a golden-haired prince, silent but observant, aloof but full of latent potential. The court around him was a careful tapestry of alliances and rivalries. The nobles of Persia, powerful landowners and generals, kept close watch on the prince's maturation. The priests of Zoroaster, wary of idolatry and foreign gods, whispered guidance into his ears about moral purity and the cosmic struggle between truth and lie. The eunuchs and courtiers, ever ambitious, formed shifting allegiances in anticipation of the day when Cyrus would no longer reign. Cambyses learned, often silently, how fragile loyalty could be, even in the heart of power. His younger brother, Bardia, was a figure of contrast. Where Cambyses was stoic and intense, Bardia was reportedly more affable, more approachable. There were murmurs that Bardia, not Cambyses, was the people's favorite. Whether those murmurs were the inventions of palace gossip or real political sentiments is unclear, but they would haunt Cambyses in the years to come. The very idea that he, the crown prince, might be overshadowed not only by his father but by his own brother, was a seed of bitterness that likely took root early. As the years passed, Cambyses matured into a tall, commanding presence. His features sharp, his eyes narrow, his voice deliberate. Those who met him often described him as brilliant yet inscrutable. He spoke with precision, rarely betrayed emotion, and carried himself like one who had already borne the weight of 1,000 expectations. To the outer world, he was the ideal successor, disciplined, educated, born of noble blood. But within the inner walls of the palace, those closest to him began to notice a certain darkness in his gaze, a rigidity in his mannerisms, an ambition that did not always temper itself with mercy. It was not until Cyrus launched his final campaign against the fierce Massagetæ of Central Asia that the question of succession moved from theory to reality. Cambyses was left to govern much of the empire in his father's absence, an enormous responsibility for a prince in his early 20s. Though not yet crowned, he held the reins of administration, liaised with satraps, and enforced the rule of law across an empire that was still in the process of understanding its own identity. This interregnum would test him more than any tutor or ceremony ever had. The death of Cyrus, whether on the battlefield or due to injuries sustained in war, sent a shockwave through the empire. The man who had made Persia great was gone, and now the son was to take the throne. Cambyses, already acting as regent, ascended without immediate opposition, but not without tension. There were whispers that the death was too sudden, too convenient. There were questions about whether the empire could maintain its unity under a man who, unlike his father, was not known for compassion or flexibility. The coronation of Cambyses II was a subdued affair. There was no jubilation in the streets, no oracles proclaiming a golden age. Instead, there was unease among satraps, among priests, and even among the foreign diplomats who had watched Cyrus's reign with awe. Cambyses was an unknown quantity, and in the realm of empire, uncertainty was as dangerous as weakness. Yet the new king wasted no time in asserting himself. He immediately reaffirmed Persian dominance over Babylon and the western provinces. He tightened control over the satrapies, implemented new military levies, and sent scouts and envoys to the borders of Egypt. For in his mind, there was a score yet to settle. Cyrus had left one great power unconquered, the land of the Nile. Egypt had stood as a defiant monument to the ancient world, a civilization older than Babylon, steeped in ritual, with a lineage of pharaohs tracing back 3,000 years. Under Pharaoh Amasis and later Psamtik III, Egypt had regained some of its former strength. It had forged alliances with Greek mercenaries, fortified its borders, and resisted Persian overtures. Cambyses saw not just a military challenge, but a legacy to complete. If his father had conquered the Fertile Crescent, he would extend the empire to the shores of the Mediterranean. But more than ambition drove him. Egypt was, to Cambyses, a mirror, an ancient kingdom led by gods in human form, much like how Persians saw their own Shahanshah. To conquer Egypt was not just a political victory. It was symbolic dominance over history itself. Cambyses wanted to be remembered not as the son of Cyrus, but as the man who surpassed him. Even as the gears of war began to turn, Cambyses remained haunted by the expectations that trailed him like a shadow. Every advisor he met had once sworn loyalty to his father. Every temple he visited had once been rebuilt by Cyrus's decree. Even in his dreams, It is said, he saw the towering presence of his father, watching, judging, perhaps even warning. But the young king pressed forward. He ordered the assembly of an army that would march through the Sinai. He summoned Phoenician ships to blockade Egypt's coast. He sent word to the Arabian tribes, negotiating safe passage and water supplies for his legions. The wheels of history began to churn once more, and at their center stood a man with everything to prove and nothing to lose. Thus began the reign of Cambyses II, not with fanfare, not with joy, but with a silent determination that could not be mistaken. In the dry wind that swept across the Persian plateau, there was a whisper. The boy who grew up in a legend's shadow was now writing a legend of his own. The throne of Persia, carved from granite and history, awaited the son of the world's greatest conqueror. But when Cambyses II ascended it, the empire did not erupt in celebration. There was no cascade of hymns echoing through the streets of Persepolis, no doves released to the heavens from the rooftops of Babylon. Instead, there was a hush, a stillness, a murmur that echoed down the marble corridors and across distant provinces, a whisper that the empire stood on the precipice of change, and that the son of Cyrus was not his father. Cambyses inherited not only an empire of vast territories but a vision that had redefined civilization. Cyrus the Great had built his dominion not merely through force of arms but through a revolutionary principle. That the conquered could coexist with the conquerors, that temples could stand beside fortresses, and that law could be a bridge between tongues. Babylon, Lydia, Media, each territory had its gods, its customs, and its language, and Cyrus had mastered the delicate art of ruling them all without reducing them to ruins. When Cambyses took the throne in 530 BCE, the imperial foundations were strong, but the structure above them was unfinished. The West bristled with untamed ambition. The Ionian cities remained unruly, and the Aegean Sea was more Greek than Persian. In the south, Egypt stood defiant, a remnant of the old world clinging to its pride. And to the east, the steppes of Central Asia still harbored tribes that neither bowed to kings nor obeyed empires. Cambyses did not inherit peace. He inherited a challenge disguised as inheritance. Yet the machinery of succession had been carefully set in motion by Cyrus before his final campaign. Cambyses had already acted as regent, had signed edicts in his father's name, had reviewed garrisons and appointed satraps. He was not a stranger to rule. But there is a difference between shadow and sunlight, and Cambyses now stood fully exposed to the gaze of a skeptical world. In the weeks following his ascension, the royal court observed Cambyses with guarded curiosity. He moved with the precision of a man who had memorized every ritual but found no joy in performance. He attended the fire temples and offered sacrifices with the Zoroastrian priests, but his prayers lacked the warmth that had made his father beloved by both high and low. His addresses to the nobles were meticulously worded, yet curiously cold. He reissued proclamations affirming the loyalty of the satrapies, but none bore the signature flourishes of Cyrus's diplomacy. Where Cyrus had governed with a smile and a sword, Cambyses wielded only the latter. The Persian nobility watched, some with apprehension, others with ambition. Among them were the ancient houses, descendants of kings and generals, tied to the Achaemenid line by blood or battle. They had been loyal to Cyrus because he had made them great. With Cambyses, that loyalty had to be earned anew. Some were content to wait. Others whispered of Bardia, the younger brother, less stern, more personable, a man of the people. Rumors began to curl like smoke through the bazaars of Susa and the taverns of Sardis, that the true heir to the heart of the empire was not the man who wore the crown. Bardia had been appointed governor of the eastern provinces, Bactria, Sogdiana, and the lands bordering the Industry. It was a symbolic posting, rich but distant, and perhaps deliberately isolating. He was popular among the troops stationed there, especially among the Median and Elamite contingents. Whether Cambyses saw this as a threat or a matter of expediency, none could say. But the brothers did not correspond. No letters between them have survived, if they were ever written at all. Within the inner sanctum of the palace, Cambyses began to surround himself with loyalists, advisors who had risen not through noble birth but through merit or quiet servitude. Among them was Prexaspes, a minister whose loyalty was absolute, and whose eyes never strayed from the throne. There was also the high priest of Ahura Mazda, a stern traditionalist who whispered to Cambyses about righteousness and divine mandate. These were not warm companions. They were pillars of steel, unyielding, firm, and trusted. Perhaps that was what Cambyses sought. Not friends, but instruments. In his first year of rule, Cambyses initiated a series of administrative reforms. He ordered new census counts in the western provinces to better assess tax and troop obligations. He sent judges to audit satraps and root out corruption, a practice initiated by his father, but now carried out with harsher scrutiny. He expanded the use of Aramaic as a lingua franca across the Western Empire, aiming to create unity through bureaucratic clarity. These measures were practical, even visionary, but they came with a cost: resentment. To many, Cambyses' rule began to feel like a tightening noose rather than a guiding hand. Religious leaders, too, watched the new king with unease. Zoroastrianism had flourished under Cyrus, who had respected the fire temples while tolerating local cults. Cambyses, though outwardly pious, began to display signs of impatience with ritual. He spoke less of moral dualism and more of obedience. He offered no new patronage to temples, and his attendance at seasonal festivals became less frequent. There was no blasphemy, but there was distance, a growing gulf between the king and the sacred institutions that undergirded the empire's spiritual life. Amid this atmosphere of tension, Cambyses made his first great decision as sole ruler. He would invade Egypt. It was not a spontaneous act of conquest. The idea had been seeded years before, possibly even in Cyrus's lifetime. Egypt, under the Sate dynasty, had once been a great power, but by the late 6th century BCE, it was a kingdom in decline. Pharaoh Cambyses II had stabilized it, but through foreign alliances and Greek mercenaries. His successor, Psamtik III, was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by a court riddled with intrigue. Egypt was rich. Its granaries overflowed, its temples glittered, and its priesthood controlled vast estates. But it was isolated, hemmed in by desert, sea, and ambition. Cambyses saw in Egypt not merely a province to conquer, but a crown to complete his father's vision. Persia ruled Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, and the edges of India. To rule Egypt was to bind East and West under one diadem. It was to hold the ancient world in one hand. But the road to the Nile was treacherous. The deserts of Sinai and the hostility of Arab tribes had thwarted past invaders. Cambyses knew he could not march alone. He began, instead, with diplomacy. He reached out to the Arabian tribes that controlled the wells of the desert. Gold, grain, and promises flowed from Persepolis to the oases of the Negev and the Red Sea. These tribes, wary of Egypt's disdain for outsiders, agreed to aid the Persian army's passage. Cambyses also courted the Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, whose ships and sailors were essential for a naval campaign. He offered favorable trade terms and autonomy in exchange for maritime support. The Phoenicians, pragmatic as ever, agreed. Even within Egypt, Cambyses found allies. A discontented general named Ajahorisnit, a powerful priest and naval commander, had begun correspondence with the Persian court. Greek mercenaries, serving in Egypt but loyal only to gold, were tempted by Persian envoys. Cambyses, without drawing a sword, had already begun to unravel the Egyptian court from within. Preparations took years. Armies were assembled in Cilicia and Syria. Supply chains were established, stretching across the desert with painstaking care. Engineers mapped out oases, measured distances, and plotted courses. The royal road, the backbone of the empire's communication network, buzzed with dispatches and military orders. Cambyses moved with methodical patience, like a hunter circling prey. Back in the capital, however, uncertainty persisted. Cambyses rarely appeared in public. He issued decrees but offered no explanations. He consulted with his generals but revealed little of his mind. Even his inner circle found him difficult to read. Some said he spoke to no one for days. Others claimed he wandered the gardens of the palace at night, lost in thought. Still others believed he was haunted by his father's spirit, that he sought visions in the fire temples but received only silence. Then came the omens. In Babylon, the moon was eclipsed, and the priests interpreted it as a sign of imperial peril. In Susa, a statue of a lion cracked down the middle. In Egypt, an ibis, a sacred bird, was found dead in a temple well. These were not merely superstitions. In the ancient world, kings were judged not only by policy but by portents. Cambyses, hearing of these signs, did not issue comfort or decree rituals to appease the gods. He said nothing. What he did do was seal a final order, the full mobilization of the Persian army for the Egyptian campaign. The empire stirred. Across 100 provinces, soldiers donned their armor, Persians, Medes, Lydians, Bactrians, and more. Chariots creaked into motion, elephants were loaded with supplies, and ships set sail with black sails toward the Nile Delta. Cambyses himself left the capital not in triumph but in silence, departing at dawn with only a short address to his advisors. "Hold the empire. I will return with a crown." It was a promise but also a warning. As Cambyses disappeared over the horizon with the dust of war rising behind him, the people of Persia watched with held breath. Would he succeed where others had failed? Would he fall as his father had fallen? And what of the brother left behind? The murmurs of dissent. The priests who no longer sang his praises? The crown now rested on Cambyses' head. But it was heavy, cold, and laced with thorns. And as he rode into the deserts of the West, he carried with him not only the hopes of an empire, but the weight of a silence that no victory could ever truly fill. The desert was not just a place, it was a crucible. Between the empire of Persia and the storied land of Egypt stretched a sea of sand, merciless and ancient, a barrier that had humbled kings and buried ambitions beneath its endless dunes. Cambyses II knew this, but he was not deterred. He was not merely marching an army. He was marching history forward, determined to bind together the twin legacies of Mesopotamia and the Nile, east and west, under the singular vision of the Achaemenid world. By 526 BCE, Cambyses had transformed his ambition into momentum. His forces, drawn from every corner of the empire, began to converge on the Levant. From Bactria came cavalry born of the steppes. From Lydia, hardened Greek mercenaries trained in phalanx formation. From Elam and Media, archers and engineers. From Phoenician ports, a navy prepared to blockade the Egyptian coast. It was a mosaic of peoples, faiths, and tongues, all stitched together by imperial command and the promise of conquest. Cambyses himself led the preparations with relentless attention to detail. He was not the kind of king who delegated from a gilded throne. He reviewed supply lines, inspected water caravans, studied maps hand-copied from Babylonian and Arabian archives. He summoned desert scouts and questioned them about every hill and ravine between Gaza and the Nile. His officers recorded distances between oases, calculated daily water requirements, and consulted with Arabian sheiks to ensure the loyalty of desert tribes. Perhaps the most significant logistical masterstroke was Cambyses' alliance with these Arabian tribes. They controlled the lifeblood of the desert, wells and springs known only to those who had survived the unforgiving terrain for generations. Cambyses did not treat them as subjects to be bribed or coerced. Instead, he approached them as necessary partners, offering gold, autonomy, and permanent trade privileges across the empire. In return, they agreed to safeguard the Persian army's passage and to build a chain of cisterns that would sustain the advance across the Sinai. It was not merely strategic genius. It was historical redemption. For centuries, empires had broken their strength upon Egypt's isolation. Cambyses would be different. He would not charge blindly. He would walk the sands with the consent of those who lived beneath them. As the army departed Gaza, the The size of the force was staggering. Tens of thousands of men moved in columns, infantry, cavalry, engineers, laborers, and animal handlers. Elephants hauled siege equipment. Carts carried barley and dried dates. Camel caravans bore skins of water, each one precious beyond measure. At the rear, scribes documented every mile, every well, every village, ensuring that this march would be remembered in the annals of empire. And still, despite the preparation, the journey across the Sinai tested every resolve. Temperatures soared by day and plunged by night. Winds scoured skin raw. Men collapsed from exhaustion, and some went mad from thirst. There were deaths, inevitable, bitter, and swift. But the line moved on, always westward, always toward the Nile. Cambyses rode near the front, his gaze fixed on the horizon, saying little, his mind absorbed in what lay beyond. The desert was more than geography. It was transformation. By the time the Persian army emerged near Pelusium, the eastern gateway of Egypt, it was no longer a coalition, it was a force shaped by ordeal. The bonds formed in suffering, the discipline hardened by scarcity, the trust earned through survival. These were the true weapons Cambyses carried. Waiting for him was a kingdom unprepared for what was coming. In the months before the Persian arrival, Pharaoh Cambyses II had died, leaving the throne to his son, Psamtik III. The new pharaoh was young, inexperienced, and thrust into crisis. Egypt's defenses were in disarray. Internal dissent festered. Greek mercenaries, once loyal, now eyed the horizon uncertainly. The priesthood whispered of omens, of a foreign king who would desecrate temples and unravel Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. Psamtik III attempted to rally his forces at Pelusium, a fortified city at the mouth of the Nile. He called upon the gods, raised battalions of native infantry, and placed Greek hoplites in the vanguard. But he had no time. The Persian army, lean and disciplined from its desert crucible, arrived sooner than any Egyptian astrologer had predicted. Then came one of the most striking moments of psychological warfare in the ancient world. Cambyses, well-versed in Egyptian beliefs, had learned that cats were sacred to the Egyptians, living embodiments of the goddess Batet. In an act of calculated brilliance, he ordered his soldiers to paint the image of cats and sacred animals on their shields. Some sources, including later Greek accounts, even claim that he released cats and other animals onto the battlefield, knowing the Egyptians would hesitate to harm them. Whether literal or symbolic, the effect was devastating. As the battle commenced, Egyptian troops found themselves paralyzed by fear of sacrilege. Arrows were loosed with trembling hands. Infantry hesitated to advance. Cambyses, recognizing the moment, ordered a full assault. The Persian flanks swept in like a tide, and the Egyptian line broke. The soldiers of Psamtik fled, many into the marshes, others into the city walls. Those who were captured were spared no mercy. Pelusium fell. With the gateway to the Nile open, Cambyses marched on Memphis. The city, proud and steeped in myth, held out briefly, but its defenses were no match for the Persian siege engines and naval blockade. Within weeks, the capital surrendered. Psamtik III was taken alive, paraded through the streets, and held captive under heavy guard. Cambyses had done what no king since the rise of the Sate dynasty had achieved. He had broken Egypt in a single campaign. The Nile, once the lifeline of a sovereign realm, now flowed under Persian command. The temples, the granaries, the royal palaces, all were brought under the imperial seal. But conquest was never just about territory. It was about legitimacy. To rule Egypt, Cambyses needed more than a sword. He needed a crown. And so he underwent the ritual coronation as pharaoh, donning the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, standing before the priests of Ptah and Osiris, making offerings to the gods of a land not his own. He spoke the sacred words. He walked the prescribed paths. He became, at least in ceremony, a son of Ra. Yet something was missing. The Egyptian priesthood, always political beneath its piety, played along, out of fear, not devotion. The common people obeyed, but their eyes held no reverence. Cambyses ruled, but he did not belong. It was a subtle but significant difference from his father. Cyrus, when he entered Babylon, had been welcomed as a liberator. His restoration of temples and protection of local customs earned him the love of the people. Cambyses, despite his efforts, did not inspire the same sentiment. His conquest was efficient, but not affectionate. His authority was recognized, but not revered. Even so, he pressed forward with reforms. He appointed Egyptians to high offices, retained local governors where possible, and ensured grain shipments continued uninterrupted. He ordered the restoration of canals and the maintenance of temples. He met with priests, listened to their concerns, and offered gold for rituals. Yet beneath these gestures, a tension festered. Some of his Persian officers resented his attempts to integrate Egyptian elites. Some Egyptians viewed his rule as a sacrilege. Regardless of his policies, Cambyses, ever vigilant, began to withdraw into his inner circle. He questioned the loyalty of local officials. He increased surveillance, and in moments of frustration, he lashed out not with chaos, but with calculated severity. Then came the fateful incident at the Serapeum of Memphis. A sacred bull, believed by the Egyptians to be the living incarnation of the god Apis, was reported to have died. A new calf, marked with the divine symbols, was selected and presented for public worship. Cambyses, according to Greek historians like Herodotus, either misunderstood or rejected the significance. In a moment of fury, he allegedly stabbed the calf, mocking the idea of divinity in animal form. Whether this account is entirely true remains uncertain. Some modern historians suggest it may have been exaggerated or invented by enemies of Cambyses. But the impact was real. News spread that the foreign king had desecrated the gods. The priesthood recoiled. The people whispered. The fragile trust Cambyses had tried to build began to crumble. What had begun as a campaign of conquest now became an occupation tinged with distrust. Cambyses remained in Egypt longer than expected, attempting to stabilize his new province. He planned further campaigns into Nubia, into Carthage, but logistics faltered and rebellions simmered. His once glorious march across the desert now felt like the beginning of a deeper exile. And all the while, back in Persia, the shadow he had once outrun began to stir. News from the heartland grew sparse. Satraps wrote of strange occurrences. Whispers arose that Bardia, the brother left behind, had been seen issuing commands. Some said it was a usurper. Others said Bardia had never died at all. Cambyses, upon hearing these rumors, grew silent. He summoned trusted messengers, dispatched envoys, and questioned his closest advisors. The desert, once his crucible, now became a prison. Egypt, once his crown jewel, now felt like a trap. In Memphis, Cambyses stood at the banks of the Nile, watching the water flow northward, always away from him. He had conquered a kingdom of stone and sand, but in doing so, he had lost sight of the land that gave him birth. The road to the Nile had made him a conqueror, but it had also left him far from home. In the history of conquest, there are battles that shift borders, and there are battles that shift the world. Pelusium was both. At the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, where desert met marsh and stone walls faced the sun-bleached sands, Cambyses II confronted the last great civilization to resist the Achaemenid Empire. What transpired there would not only complete a vision born under Cyrus the Great, but also reveal the precarious fault lines of Cambyses' own identity: warrior, ruler, exile, pharaoh. The Persian army, battle-hardened by its brutal march across the Sinai, now stood before the ancient bastion of Pelusium. Built as a bulwark against Asiatic invasion, the city was Egypt's first line of defense. Its massive mud-brick walls had withstood generations of raiders. It was surrounded by shallow lakes and shifting sands, a landscape engineered as much by nature as by dynastic will. But no wall, no moat, no high priest's incantation could undo what had been set in motion. Cambyses studied the field with meticulous calculation. He understood that Egypt, proud and myth-bound, did not merely defend territory, it defended a worldview. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a god in flesh. His soldiers did not fight for survival but for cosmic balance, for the preservation of Ma'at, the sacred order. To defeat them on the battlefield was to unravel their universe. So Cambyses chose not only to strike but to strike at the soul. He had long prepared for this moment. Among his advisors were translators, diplomats, and even defectors from Egypt's own priesthood. They had told him of the Egyptian reverence for cats, ibis, and other sacred animals. In their mythology, these creatures were vessels of divinity. To harm them was a crime punishable by death. Cambyses did not mock these beliefs. He weaponized them. On the eve of battle, his troops painted images of Batet, the cat goddess, on their shields. Some accounts, particularly Greek retellings, claim that he released cats and other animals onto the field, allowing them to run free before the Egyptian lines. Whether metaphor or reality, the effect was profound. The soldiers of Psamtik III, bound by taboo and reverence, hesitated. Arrows were drawn but not loosed. Blades trembled in their sheaths. Then the Persians struck. They came in disciplined phalanxes, supported by archers and cavalry, each unit drilled in the open plains of Persia and the mountains of Media. The Egyptians, though brave, fought disjointedly. Their lines broke. Some units retreated to the walls of Pelusium, others scattered into the marshes. Psamtik III, seeing the unraveling of his army, fled toward Memphis, hoping to make a final stand at the capital. Cambyses allowed no delay. The moment the walls of Pelusium fell, he ordered a pursuit. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who surrendered were spared, most of them. Cambyses had learned well from his father that mercy could be a weapon of its own. A city spared became a story whispered across provinces, often more powerful than an army marching. But the mercy was selective, strategic, and cold. The Nile Delta, once a land of grain and song, now echoed with the march of Persian boots. The siege of Memphis followed quickly. Cambyses, cautious not to destroy the city's temples or anger its priesthood further, offered surrender terms. Psamtik III refused. He fortified the city's defenses and summoned what remained of his forces. Greek mercenaries, fierce and disciplined, formed a final shield around the throne. But Cambyses had time and numbers. He laid siege for weeks, surrounding the city by land and water. The Phoenician fleet blockaded the ports. Supply lines were cut. Famine loomed. Within the city, morale began to crumble. And then, the gates opened. Not in surrender, but in desperation. A breakout attempt by the remaining mercenaries failed. Psamtik III was captured. Cambyses did not celebrate. He stood at the gates of Memphis, silent, staring at the city that had withstood generations of conflict and diplomacy. Now it was his. But in the stillness of victory, a strange emptiness hung in the air. He had conquered Egypt's defenses, shattered its armies, and humbled its god-king. But the Nile did not bow. Its waters flowed as they always had, indifferent to conquest. Its priests muttered prayers to gods Cambyses could neither see nor name, and its people looked upon their new ruler not with fear or reverence, but with a deep, ancient sorrow. Psamtik III was brought before him, young, regal, but defeated. Cambyses spared his life, at least at first. He allowed him to remain in Egypt as a ceremonial figure, hoping to ease the transition of power. It was a calculated mercy, one that echoed Cyrus's model in Babylon. But Cambyses was not Cyrus, and Egypt was not Babylon. Tensions flared. Rebellions sparked in Thebes and other southern cities. The priesthood, despite public submission, continued to foment resistance in private. Cambyses responded with severity. He dispatched troops to crush uprisings, executed suspected conspirators, and stripped temples of their autonomy. His patience waned, his trust eroded, and then came the incident that would haunt his legacy. According to Herodotus and later Greek sources, Cambyses desecrated the sacred bull Apis, a divine animal believed by Egyptians to be the living incarnation of Ptah. The Greeks claimed that Cambyses laughed at the worship of a beast, struck the bull, and ordered its priests punished. Modern historians dispute the accuracy of this tale, suggesting it may be exaggeration or outright fabrication by hostile chroniclers. But the damage was done. The Egyptian people believed it. In their eyes, Cambyses had not only conquered their lands but blasphemed their gods. It was no longer a question of political rule. It was cosmic imbalance. Ma'at had been shattered. Isfit chaos had entered Egypt in the form of a foreign king. Cambyses, perhaps aware of his growing alienation, attempted to bridge the gap. He adopted Egyptian regalia, referred to himself as Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, and oversaw rituals in the temples. He preserved the tax structures, maintained irrigation projects, and even restored damaged shrines. He appointed Egyptian officials to administrative posts. On the surface, it was an extension of Persian tolerance. But the trust was gone. The priesthood had turned inward, guarding its rights from imperial eyes. The people complied, but only in silence. Cambyses ruled Egypt, but never entered its heart. The coronation had given him the crown, but not the myth. He was pharaoh in title, foreigner in truth. Frustration gnawed at him. He had expected resistance. He had expected the burden of rule. But he had not expected indifference. Victory had come too swiftly. The empire's will had turned in his favor, but the road beneath him cracked. His letters to his satraps grew shorter. His mood, darker. Those who had once advised him began to fall from favor, replaced by men of sterner disposition. Prexaspes, his minister and confidant, became more prominent. Rumors spread of secret executions, of spies among the ranks, of Cambyses walking the corridors of Memphis at night, talking to no one. He launched campaigns into Nubia. The dream of an African dominion shriveled in the heat. Cambyses returned to Memphis, defeated not by an enemy, but by distance and logistics. Meanwhile, in the east the empire stirred. Messages from Persia became infrequent. Satraps reported strange occurrences. Whispers emerged of Bardia, Cambyses' brother, long absent, now issuing decrees in the heartland. Some claimed he had never been killed. Others said an impostor had taken his place. Cambyses, hearing these reports, fell into fury or despair. He prepared to return. Egypt had become a gilded cage. His conquest, once triumphant, now felt hollow. The Nile, with all its wealth, had offered no peace. The people obeyed but would not kneel. The gods watched but did not speak. And so Cambyses rode out once more, across the sands he had conquered, toward a home he no longer recognized, toward a brother who may or may not be real. Pelusium had been the gateway to a dream, but every gateway leads two ways. Egypt was now his. The double crown rested upon Cambyses' head, the white of Upper Egypt and the red of Lower Egypt, symbols of dominion that had adorned pharaohs for millennia. He sat in the palace at Memphis, beneath painted ceilings of stars and walls etched with hieroglyphs of eternity. Outside, the Nile flowed as it always had, unconcerned with the affairs of men. But for Cambyses, now the master of Egypt, an unease lingered. Though the land had bowed before him, it did not embrace him. He had conquered its cities, subdued its armies, walked its temples and sat upon its throne, but Egypt remained indifferent. From the moment he assumed the mantle of pharaoh, Cambyses faced the limits of power's illusion. The rituals were elaborate, the robes heavy with gold, the priests careful in their obeisance. But the devotion was thin. Every gesture was calculated, every prayer recited under the breath, every smile half-forced. Cambyses could sense it. These were not the adulations given to Ramses or Thutmose. These were courtesies to a conqueror, performed out of necessity, not reverence. His reign in Egypt began with measured intent. Cambyses was no mindless tyrant. He issued decrees that respected traditional tax systems. He ensured temples continued to receive grain shipments. He forbade the looting of sacred sites and reaffirmed the property rights of powerful priestly estates. He even ordered the restoration of shrines damaged during the initial conquests. In structure, his rule mimicked the policies of his father Cyrus, who had rebuilt Babylonian temples and honored local customs. But there was one crucial difference. Where Cyrus inspired genuine loyalty, Cambyses stirred caution and concealed hostility. The Egyptian priesthood, outwardly compliant, remained the most impenetrable barrier. Deeply woven into the spiritual and political life of Egypt, they held sway over the population through festivals, funerary rites, and the vast narratives of cosmic order. Cambyses, despite his efforts, could not speak their language. Not in words, and certainly not in symbols. His ascension as pharaoh was a legal formality. To the priests, he remained an outsider, a usurper of divine status. Behind their ritual bows were whispered curses. Cambyses noticed. The silence of the temple courts was too clean, the processions too practiced. He could feel the chill in the air when he entered their sanctuaries. He had entered Egypt as a victor, but he lived within it as a ghost. Respected, perhaps feared, but never loved. And for a man who had grown beneath the towering legacy of Cyrus the Great, this failure to inspire gnawed at something deeper than pride. It touched his sense of self, his conviction in the destiny he believed had been passed to him like a royal flame. The longer he stayed, the more restless he became. Rebellions in the south, particularly around Thebes and Elephantine, forced him to dispatch military columns to suppress unrest. These were not full-scale wars but persistent agitations, driven more by religious defiance than political insurrection. Cambyses responded with characteristic severity. Leaders were executed, shrines desecrated, wealth seized. He replaced several local governors with Persian administrators, stripping ancient families of their authority. The message was clear: mercy had limits. Among the Egyptian people, fear took root but not obedience. Cambyses had misread the culture he sought to rule. In Persia, strength was often admired. In Egypt, it had to be sanctified. Without divine legitimacy affirmed by the priests, his commands lacked moral weight. His image was etched into monuments beside traditional pharaohs, but those inscriptions did not carry the resonance of eternity. To the average Egyptian, Cambyses was not Motker or Nebmater. He was the foreigner who wore the symbols but not the spirit. Within his court, isolation grew. Prexaspes remained his closest confidant, but even he could not soothe the king's growing detachment. Cambyses became withdrawn, more suspicious of those around him. He suspected Egyptian nobles of collusion. He accused his own advisors of withholding information. He dismissed translators, replaced scribes, interrogated guards. The palace at Memphis became a place of silence, its stone corridors echoing with the footsteps of a man increasingly alone. It was during this time that the infamous Apis bull incident occurred. A sacred bull had died in Memphis, and the priest selected a new calf marked with divine signs, announcing its arrival with celebration. The Apis was not merely a symbol. It was the embodiment of Ptah, a god of creation, and the animal was worshipped, housed in luxury, and given daily offerings. Cambyses attended the ceremony, but what followed remains clouded in legend and controversy. According to Herodotus, who chronicled the event with dramatic flair, Cambyses mocked the worshippers, declared the animal a fraud, and stabbed it in the thigh. He reportedly ordered the priests beaten and banned the celebration. Egyptian sources, few and fragmented, do not explicitly confirm this version. Modern historians suspect exaggeration or propaganda, possibly fed by political rivals or later Greek retellings. But what matters is not necessarily the factual truth. It is what the people believed. The story spread like wildfire. Cambyses had killed a god. Whether he had or not, the perception was irreversible. The Apis desecration became the crystallization of every fear, every resentment, every whisper in the streets. To the Egyptians, this was not the act of a ruler. It was the sign of madness, of impiety, of chaos. Ma'at had been violated. And if Cambyses was capable of this, what more would he do? The political cost was immediate. Support among local administrators eroded. Rebellions intensified. Priests quietly encouraged non-cooperation. Cambyses responded with more force. Executions increased. Property was confiscated. The royal treasury swelled with gold, but the people emptied of faith. And still Cambyses remained. He spent nearly 3 years in Egypt, longer than he had originally planned. He had dreamed of using Egypt as a springboard for further conquest, Nubia to the south, Carthage to the west. But logistical nightmares plagued his efforts. His army into Nubia suffered catastrophic losses from heat, hunger, and miscalculation. The campaign collapsed before reaching its target. His planned naval assault on Carthage was cancelled when Phoenician sailors, loyal to their ancestral roots in Tyre, refused to fight their cousins across the sea. Every path forward was blocked, not by force but by loyalty and spirit. Cambyses commanded an empire, but he could not compel belief. It was during this time that letters from Persia began to grow sparse. The royal road, once a highway of updates, slowed to a trickle. Satraps wrote cautiously, vaguely. Cambyses summoned messengers. Some returned with conflicting reports. Others vanished in the desert. Whispers emerged, absurd at first, but increasingly persistent, that Bardia, his younger brother, had been seen in the cities of Persia issuing decrees. Cambyses froze. Bardia was dead. He had ordered it himself in secret years ago, fearing a potential rival. It had been done quietly, far from public view to avoid scandal. Only Prexasps had carried out the command, and only he and Cambyses knew the truth. If Bardia now ruled in his name, it could only be an impostor or a ghost. Either way, Cambyses had no choice. He ordered preparations to return to Persia. Egypt, once the crown jewel of his ambitions, had become a gilded prison. He could not rebuild the spiritual bonds he had broken. He could not drown out the silence of its priests or the vacant stares of its people. He had ruled as Pharaoh, but never as son of the gods. The Nile flowed beneath him, but never around him. His departure was not triumphant. There were no processions, no ceremonies. He left as he had arrived, deliberate, armored, silent. But within him stirred a storm. His brother, real or false, had taken his name. His court, loyal or afraid, had gone quiet. And his empire, built on dreams, now stood on shifting sands. He crossed the desert once more, riding toward a home that may no longer be his. Behind him, Egypt exhaled, quietly, cautiously. It had outlasted conquerors before. Cambyses had worn the crown, but Egypt had never worn his name. The desert stretched before him, endless and searing. Cambyses rode not as a conqueror now, but as a king in retreat, not from battle but from silence. Behind him, Egypt receded into myth and memory, its temples whispering prayers he would never understand. Ahead, Persia loomed, his homeland, his inheritance, now teetering under shadows of deception. The messages had grown urgent, contradictory, laced with dread. A man claiming to be Bardia, his brother, long dead by Cambyses' own order, had seized the throne. It was impossible, and yet the empire behaved as though it were true. Satraps bowed to this new authority. Royal edicts were issued in Bardia's name. The court, once bound to Cambyses by loyalty and fear, had gone silent. The fire temples lit incense not for the absent king but for the resurrected prince. Cambyses was no longer merely Pharaoh in exile. He was Shahanshah without a throne. The journey across the Near East became a crucible. The summer sun battered his caravan. Food and water ran short. Men deserted. The few who remained, advisors, bodyguards, generals, watched their king with growing unease. Cambyses spoke little, rode alone, and gazed too long at the horizon. At night, he sat beside campfires, whispering to himself, sometimes pacing in circles, sometimes staring at the stars without blinking. What began as anxiety soon morphed into something darker. He began to suspect everyone. His own guards, he claimed, were spies. His servants, he whispered, were feeding information to the false Bardia. Prexasps, once his most trusted advisor, became a man of riddles and double meanings. Cambyses questioned him endlessly, as though trying to crack the truth from his silence. But there was no truth Cambyses could face. He had ordered Bardia's death years earlier, in secret, consumed by the fear of rivalry. Bardia had been popular, more charming, more gracious, a figure who inspired affection where Cambyses commanded respect. Even in childhood, Bardia's shadow had followed him, so Cambyses had acted ruthlessly with the cold logic of power. Prexasps, loyal and discreet, had carried out the deed. The body had been buried quietly. No funerals, no mourning, no proof. Now that absence of evidence returned to haunt him. If the empire believed Bardia lived, then the truth no longer mattered. The fiction had taken root. And worse still, Cambyses had no way to disprove it without admitting the murder, a confession that would destroy whatever claim he still held to righteousness. He was caught between silence and exposure, madness and admission, guilt and survival. In Ecbatana, the summer capital nestled among the mountains, Cambyses arrived in secrecy. The city had not prepared for his return. Its temples offered no welcome. Its nobles had pledged fealty to the man now calling himself Bardia. Cambyses did not enter as a ruler reclaiming his realm, but as a fugitive creeping into the home that had forgotten his name. And there, in the quiet halls of the palace, the truth unraveled. The man on the throne was not Bardia, at least, not the real one. Cambyses learned through whispers, through bribed servants and loyal generals, that the new ruler bore the face of Bardia but not the memories. He avoided the old friends of the prince. He hesitated when asked about events from their childhood. He issued proclamations in oddly formal language, as though reading a role rather than living it. Some said he was a Magian priest named Gaumeda, a figure who had long resented the royal house and sought its collapse from within. The realization should have brought Cambyses relief. It did not. It brought fury. He had sacrificed his brother to preserve the empire, only to see it handed to a fraud. He had endured the alienation of Egypt, the burden of kingship, the endless comparisons to Cyrus, all for a throne now occupied by a charlatan cloaked in stolen flesh. Cambyses' failure was no longer just political. It was existential. His identity, his morality, his legacy, everything had been undone by the shadow of the brother he had buried. Rage became his companion. He issued orders for an army to be raised, though few responded. He summoned the satraps, but they deferred to the new regime. Even his own soldiers began to waver. They had marched with him through the sands of Sinai and the reeds of the Nile, but now their loyalty trembled. The empire, once unified under a single will, had splintered, faith had shifted, and faith was the currency of kingship. Then the wound. As Cambyses prepared for a return to Babylon, where he hoped to rally support from the priesthood and military elite, an accident occurred. Accounts differ in detail, but agree in consequence. As he mounted his horse, his sword slipped from its sheath and pierced his thigh. The wound was deep and infection swift. Within days he was fevered. Within weeks, dying. Herodotus would later claim the wound was self-inflicted, a suicide born of guilt. Others say it was divine punishment for his impiety in Egypt. Still others suggest assassination, a blade turned by one of his own. But none of these stories matter more than what Cambyses himself believed. He believed the gods had abandoned him. In his final days, bedridden and delirious, he raved about betrayal. He spoke of Bardia, of Cyrus, of Egypt, of shadows that had followed him since youth. He ordered letters sent to the empire, declaring the man on the throne an impostor. He begged those still loyal to rise up, to restore the rightful line. Some say he confessed to Bardia's murder. Others say he denied it to the end. What is certain is that he died without closure, without vindication, without a crown. Cambyses II, King of kings, conqueror of Egypt, son of Cyrus the Great, died alone. No public funeral was held. No monumental inscription honored his name. His body, according to some, was buried in secret. Others claim it was returned to Persia and interred in a modest tomb, far from the great mausoleums of his ancestors. Even in death, he was a figure of uncertainty, a riddle written in sand. And as he passed, so too did a vision. Cambyses had tried to carry forward the dream of his father, a world ruled not just by force, but by legacy. But where Cyrus had built bridges, Cambyses built walls. Where Cyrus had inspired, Cambyses enforced. Where Cyrus had believed in humanity's potential, Cambyses distrusted it. His was an empire ruled by silence and surveillance, not songs. Yet it would be too simple to label him mad. The madness of Cambyses, if madness it was, grew not from weakness but from the impossible burden of being the son of a legend. He inherited an empire that expected greatness, but gave him no space to define it. He was never allowed to be merely a ruler. He had to be Cyrus reborn or be nothing, and in trying to be more, he became less. After his death, the empire would fall briefly into chaos. The impostor Bardia Gaumata would reign only a short time before being overthrown by Darius, a distant cousin and military commander, who would later write his own version of events into stone, the Behistun inscription. In it, Cambyses was described as a just king but flawed, Bardia as a usurper, Darius as the rightful heir. History once again was edited by the victors. But between those lines, the outline of a man remains. Cambyses II, flawed, ambitious, brilliant, and haunted. He stood at the edge of two worlds, the legacy of his father and the unknowable future. He conquered Egypt, wore the crown of Pharaoh, commanded the greatest army on earth, and lost everything to a ghost. The story of Cambyses is not a tale of madness. It is a tragedy of inheritance. The empire was silent. From the peaks of the Zagros to the wide plains of Babylonia, from the golden shores of Lydia to the marshlands of the Nile, a hush had fallen over the dominion of Cambyses II. It was not the silence of peace, nor the calm before victory. It was the hush of uncertainty. A kingdom without clarity, a throne without a king, a people unsure who ruled and what truth remained. As Cambyses recovered from the wounds sustained during his campaign in Egypt, his eyes turned westward, not back to Persia yet, but toward the shimmering horizon beyond the Nile. His conquest had been swift, and though it fractured the Egyptian spirit, it had not healed the disquiet within his own. He had come to Egypt not only to conquer land but to become something greater, equal to his father, Cyrus the Great. But after 3 years in the land of pharaohs, the temples still rang hollow with false praises, and the eyes of the priests still held judgment. Egypt bowed, but did not yield. In this state of frustrated sovereignty, Cambyses began to look beyond Egypt to Carthage, Libya, and Nubia. These were the last autonomous powers in the western sweep of the known world. The conquest of Carthage would grant him control over the Mediterranean's trade routes. Libya, long a borderland of influence, would fold easily. And Nubia, the mysterious land south of Egypt, rich in gold and myth, would give him dominion over the entire Nile basin. It was not just ambition. It was necessity. He needed momentum. He needed a narrative to reclaim the loyalty of his empire. The conquest of Egypt had failed to generate the awe his father once inspired. A greater conquest, one that no Persian had yet dared, might rewrite the story. He would become not just the son of Cyrus, but the ruler of an empire that touched the edges of the world. The first campaign he planned was against Carthage. Strategically, it made sense. The Phoenician cities under Persian control, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, were maritime masters. Their ships could transport Persian forces across the Mediterranean to Carthage's coast, and a quick invasion might decapitate the growing trade empire before it became a rival. Carthage, though wealthy, was still relatively young compared to Egypt and had not yet become the military juggernaut that would later clash with Rome. But Cambyses faced an unexpected obstacle. The Phoenician mariners refused. They had sworn allegiance to the Achaemenid Empire and served Cambyses loyally in his campaigns. But Carthage had been founded by Tyrian colonists, and the blood ties remained sacred. To sail against Carthage would be to wage war against kin. The Phoenicians did not threaten rebellion. They simply refused the order. Cambyses was stunned. His empire spanned 3 continents, yet he could not compel obedience from a handful of sailors. To force them would risk open revolt along the critical coastal provinces of the eastern Mediterranean. To proceed without them would be to gamble the campaign on inferior naval capabilities. He was forced to abandon the Carthaginian expedition. It was a humiliation, quiet but heavy. He, the king of kings, was thwarted not by an enemy's blade, but by the loyalty of allies to their ancestral homeland. Undeterred, Cambyses turned south, toward Nubia. Nubia had long fascinated conquerors. Its lands were said to hold rivers of gold, strange beasts and secrets older than Egypt itself. Its people, dark-skinned and fiercely independent, had resisted Egyptian expansion for centuries. To conquer Nubia would be to fulfill what even the pharaohs had only partially achieved. Cambyses envisioned an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the heart of Africa. The campaign was launched with haste. His Egyptian advisors warned of the difficulties: sparse terrain, treacherous climate, and hostile tribes. But Cambyses pressed on. He dispatched a massive force, drawn from Egyptian, Persian, and Median ranks. Supplies were loaded, engineers assigned, maps prepared. The army would march south along the Nile and establish permanent fortifications as it advanced. But Nubia was not Egypt. The land was a scorched corridor of sand and stone. The Nile, narrower and less predictable, offered fewer natural resources. The roads were barely trails. Heat shimmered against the armor of soldiers, and thirst spread faster than commands. The locals fought not in open battle, but with harassing raids vanishing into hills and canyons. Supply lines collapsed. Horses died. Rations dwindled. The army, once proud and organized, disintegrated into chaos. Cambyses had marched toward glory, but found only desert and death. His troops, broken and starving, were forced to retreat. Some never returned. Those who did came back with stories of madness, of cannibalism, hallucinations, and men drowning in sandstorms of their own imagination. The defeat in Nubia was not just military. It was symbolic. It exposed the limits of Persian reach. It reminded his empire that even the greatest kings could not bend the earth itself to their will. And it stained Cambyses with something worse than failure: ridicule. Back in Memphis, Cambyses grew darker. His attempts at expanding the empire had collapsed. His name no longer inspired the deference it once commanded. The Egyptian priesthood had regained its confidence. In Persia, the people spoke increasingly of Bardia, the lost prince now said to be alive, issuing proclamations from Susa, reshaping the court. Cambyses became paranoid. He suspected his advisors of betrayal. He dismissed generals, imprisoned interpreters, and executed messengers. He accused Prexaspes, the man who had once carried out his secret orders, of leaking information to the false Bardia. The halls of his palace became quiet once more, this time not with reverence but with fear. In the absence of trust, he relied on himself. He began to write his own letters to satraps, imploring them to remain loyal, to ignore the rumors of his brother's return. He emphasized the fraud, insisting the man in Susa was not Bardia but an impostor, a Magian named Gaumeda. But the more he insisted, the more it sounded like desperation. The more he explained, the more the truth unraveled. In the provinces, local governors hesitated. They remembered the Cambyses who had conquered Egypt. But the Cambyses now issuing frantic letters, now whispering of conspiracies and shadows, no longer seemed the same man. Fear does not sustain loyalty indefinitely, and Cambyses had little else left to offer. He prepared to return to Persia, to Susa or Ecbatana, wherever the throne remained his. But he never made it. At a remote outpost, somewhere between Syria and the Iranian plateau, Cambyses suffered a wound. Herodotus claimed he stabbed himself while mounting his horse. Others say it was an accident, his sword falling, a misstep. Still others whisper of betrayal, a blade in the dark, a revenge taken for sins long buried. The wound festered, the heat, the dust, the fatigue of endless war and failed campaigns all compounded. Cambyses fell into fever. His guards, reduced and disheartened, could do little. He raved in his sleep, cursing the name of Bardia, calling out to Cyrus, speaking in strange tongues, sometimes Egyptian, sometimes Elamite. His body shrank, his eyes dimmed. He died in obscurity, not in the capital, not on a battlefield, not in a temple or a palace, but on the road in between triumph and failure, empire and exile. The man who had once ruled from the Aegean to the Nile, who had worn the crown of Pharaoh and claimed the legacy of the greatest king Persia had ever known, died with no subjects at his side, no priests to sing his name, no generals to raise his banner. And in that death, something ancient stirred in the heart of the empire. Cambyses had marched across deserts not just to conquer, but to matter, to shape the world in his image. But the sands swallowed his name as they swallowed his soldiers. And back in Persia, the usurper wore the crown. Cambyses had dreamed of building a world that would remember him. But the only memory left was a whisper, a king lost in the heat, chasing the horizon, too far from home. The empire did not mourn. When Cambyses II died somewhere on the road between Syria and Persia, alone, fevered, and broken, there were no state funerals, no hymns sung in Zoroastrian fire temples, no long lines of dignitaries paying their respects. His body, if returned to Persian soil at all, was buried hastily and without grandeur. Even the place of his tomb remains uncertain, an ironic fate for a king who had inherited the legacy of Cyrus the Great. What he left behind was not a crown but a void. In his final letters, hastily dictated as his wound worsened, Cambyses had tried to warn the empire of an impostor. He insisted that the man now calling himself Bardia was in fact a Magian priest named Gaumata. He begged his satraps, generals, and priests not to accept this lie. But the ink of those letters had barely dried before Cambyses himself was dead, and the words of a dead king are easily ignored. The news of his death did not arrive at once. Word traveled slowly along the royal road. When it did, the reaction across the empire was not sorrow, but silence. Cambyses had ruled with fear, with distance, and with suspicion. He had conquered Egypt but failed to win its people. He had worn the double crown but never their trust. In Persia, he had presided over justice but never love. Even the nobility, who had once feared his iron will, found themselves whispering of relief. With Cambyses gone, Bardia, or the man believed to be Bardia, assumed full control. From the royal city of Susa, he issued decrees that were immediately welcomed. Taxes were reduced across the provinces. Military conscription was relaxed. He declared a general amnesty for those imprisoned during Cambyses' reign. He opened public temples and permitted local rituals in places where Cambyses had grown harsh and repressive. To many, these changes felt like the dawn of a new golden age. And yet, something felt off. Bardia did not receive foreign dignitaries. He avoided the older generals who had once served under Cyrus. He surrounded himself with Magian priests, men loyal not to the Achaemenid royal line, but to a theocratic order within the empire. He declined to appear in public for several weeks at a time. When he did, he spoke in generalities and offered no personal reflections. The memory of his youth, the face his childhood friends remembered, the details of his life before Cambyses' ascension, none were clear. Among the nobility, suspicion grew. And within that suspicion, a new figure began to emerge, Darius. A member of the Achaemenid clan and a rising military officer under Cambyses, Darius had returned to Persia in the wake of his king's death. He came not with legions, but with letters, memories, and a claim to truth. He did not declare himself king, at least not yet. He declared only that the current ruler was not Bardia, that the real Bardia had been murdered in secret by Cambyses, that the man now on the throne was a fraud, a Magian priest named Gaumata who had exploited chaos to steal the empire. At first, few believed him. After all, Darius had no obvious claim to the throne. He was neither the son of Cambyses nor a direct heir of Cyrus. But he had allies, 6 other nobles of high birth who had grown uneasy with the growing power of the Magian priesthood. Together, they formed a council, and from that council a plan was born. On a day that would echo across the centuries, Darius and his 6 conspirators entered the royal palace in Susa. There, they found the man claiming to be Bardia. There was no grand confrontation, no speech, no trial, only knives. Gaumata, the man many had accepted as king, was slain. Darius emerged from the palace not merely as a liberator, but as the new voice of legitimacy. He did not wait. He immediately commissioned the creation of an enormous trilingual inscription, carved into a cliffside at Behistun. It was a declaration of truth, a message to the entire empire and to all of history. Cambyses was the rightful king. Bardia was killed in secret. Gaumata was an impostor. Darius had restored order. It was, in many ways, the most powerful propaganda tool in ancient history. The Behistun inscription was carved in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. It stretched over several meters, depicting Darius with his foot upon Gaumata's chest, standing tall and victorious, flanked by the gods. Below the image, thousands of words explained the chaos, the deception, and the restoration of justice. Copies of the message were sent across the empire, carved into stone, written on parchment, spoken by priests and messengers in distant provinces. The empire accepted it. It had little choice. The Achaemenid aristocracy, rattled by the instability under Cambyses and the confusion after his death, welcomed the return of order. The satraps, still loyal to the old royal line, were eager to reaffirm their place under a strong central authority. Even the people, weary of war and deception, preferred the clarity Darius offered. He promised continuity, peace, and divine approval, but the price of that clarity was Cambyses' memory. To solidify his rule, Darius began to shape the historical record. Cambyses was portrayed in ambiguous terms: a just king in some inscriptions, a paranoid tyrant in others. The secrecy of Bardia's death was justified as a necessary evil. Cambyses' military campaigns were downplayed, his victories folded into the greater glory of the empire. The story of his madness, his alleged desecration of the Apis bull, his cruelty in Egypt, his strange death were repeated without rebuttal. Cambyses became a warning, not a legacy. And yet, behind the lines of stone and the proclamations of kings, a different story persisted. Some in Egypt remembered Cambyses not as a madman, but as a distant and rigid ruler who had tried and failed to understand them. They remembered his attempts to preserve temples, his command to respect local laws, his efforts to become pharaoh. They remembered a man who stood apart, not because he hated, but because he could not connect. Some in Persia remembered his youth, his discipline, his pride, his effort to live up to a father who had become more myth than man. They remembered a son raised under the crushing weight of expectation, trying to shape an empire that did not forgive hesitation, nor mistakes, nor grief. And Darius remembered, too. He would rule for decades. He would expand the empire, defeat rebellions, and build cities. But in the shadow of every one of his victories, Cambyses remained, an unquiet ghost beneath the throne, a chapter half buried in stone. In the palace of Persepolis, where golden lions lined the stairways and courtiers from 100 nations bowed before the great king, no image of Cambyses was displayed. No statue, no portrait, only silence. A silence deeper than forgetting. A silence designed to erase. But history remembers, if only in fragments. The boy who grew up in the shadow of a legend. The king who crossed the desert and took the crown of Egypt. The ruler who marched toward greatness and found only sand. Cambyses II fell. Not from weakness, nor war, nor treason, but from the weight of being the son of a man who had redrawn the world. His story was rewritten, but not undone. Empires are not only built with stone and steel, but also with memory. The stories a civilization tells itself, of its heroes, its founders, its moments of glory, are carved deeper than inscriptions. And just as rulers may raise temples to their triumphs, they may also bury those whose lives no longer serve the narrative. Cambyses II was one such man. Once hailed as the heir of Cyrus the Great, the conqueror of Egypt, the king of the known world, he now existed as a caution, a shadow, a name whispered with discomfort in the palaces of Persepolis. After the death of Cambyses and the elimination of the impostor Gaumata, the empire stood at a crossroads. It needed clarity. It needed legitimacy. Darius, having seized the throne through cunning, speed, and an elite alliance of nobles, understood better than anyone that raw power was not enough. Rule demanded mythology, and mythology required the past to be rewritten. Cambyses' memory posed a problem. If Darius were to portray himself as the savior of the empire from an impostor, then Cambyses had to be seen as a legitimate king who had erred but acted justly. But if Cambyses had committed crimes too great, then Darius' claim to continuity would appear tainted. The solution, carefully engineered and relentlessly broadcast across the empire, was a selective remembrance, a narrative where Cambyses was king, yes, but also flawed, unstable, and ultimately consumed by his own mistakes. This reframing began with the Behistun inscription. On a high cliffside overlooking an ancient caravan route, Darius ordered artisans to carve the story of his rise. In 3 languages, he recounted how Cambyses had secretly murdered his brother Bardia out of fear, how the Magian Gaumata had then impersonated Bardia and seized the throne, how Darius, with divine sanction and noble backing, had risen to restore order. Cambyses, in this tale, was mentioned briefly. A king, yes, but one whose sins had opened the door to chaos. The message was effective. The inscription, duplicated and distributed, became the official memory of the Achaemenid Empire. Cambyses had been a cautionary tale. A king who ruled with suspicion, who desecrated sacred traditions, who lost his empire through paranoia and cruelty. His conquests were acknowledged, but never celebrated. His failures were preserved, repeated, and magnified. And so, slowly, Cambyses II began to vanish from imperial consciousness. Unlike Cyrus, who was remembered in Babylonian tablets as a liberator, or Darius, who filled his capital with reliefs of harmony and order, Cambyses left no grand monuments. His reign in Egypt was too brief, too contested. The statues erected in his honor were later defaced. His image as pharaoh was never fully adopted by the priests. In Persia, his architectural legacy was non-existent. Where his father had constructed, Cambyses had marched, and the sand erased his footsteps more easily than time. Even in death, Cambyses remained elusive. No confirmed tomb bears his name. Unlike the well-known burial site of Cyrus at Pasargadae, a grand stone monument built to endure the ages, Cambyses' resting place remains uncertain. Herodotus claimed he died by his own hand. Others said it was an accident or a divine punishment. But in truth, Cambyses' real death came not from the wound in his thigh, but from the pen and chisel of those who followed. Darius did not erase Cambyses with hatred. He erased him with silence. In the newly constructed capitals of Susa and Persepolis, Cambyses was neither venerated nor vilified. He was simply omitted. The official genealogies mention him briefly as the son of Cyrus and nothing more. The royal reliefs, depicting processions of nations and the glories of unity, contained no trace of the king who had worn the double crown of Egypt. But memory is rarely so obedient. In the fringes of the empire, Cambyses lived on, not as a ruler, but as a rumor. In Egypt, tales persisted of a foreign king who had tried to become pharaoh and failed. The priests remembered his presence, the rituals he had participated in, the bull he was accused of killing. They whispered of his efforts to understand the sacred order, his awkward attempts to wear Egyptian divinity, his increasing despair when he realized he never truly would. Some stories were cruel, that he was mad, that he drank blood, that he tore his enemies limb from limb, but others were more sympathetic, that he had been a man of burden, trying to live up to an impossible father, that he had been betrayed not only by his court, but by fate itself. In the eastern provinces, soldiers who had marched with him remembered a different man, hard, yes, but determined. A commander who had crossed the deserts with them, suffered thirst with them, buried comrades beside them. They did not see a mad king, but a relentless one. A king who demanded much but shared the struggle. And in the private rooms of aristocrats, behind closed doors and sealed scrolls, a question sometimes surfaced. What if Cambyses had lived longer? What if the impostor had never risen? What empire might have emerged if he had not tried to be Pharaoh, but instead returned home in time to secure his power? These questions had no answers, because history is not written with what might have been. Still, the ghost of Cambyses lingered. Even Darius, in his long and prosperous reign, never entirely escaped it. In moments of political unrest, whispers would resurface about the murder of Bardia, the timing of Cambyses' death, the convenient appearance of an impostor, the sudden elevation of a man with no direct claim. Darius had carved his legitimacy into rock, but rock could crack. As the decades passed, Cambyses became a figure of contradiction. To some, he was a madman, punished by the gods for sacrilege. To others, he was a tragic prince, crushed under the weight of inheritance. To a few, he was a rightful king undone by betrayal and fate. But to most, he was forgotten. And perhaps, that is the cruelest fate of all. Not to be hated, not to be misunderstood, but to be erased. To build an empire of fire and ambition, only for it to vanish into the quiet folds of history, edited out to make room for simpler stories. In this, Cambyses stands as a reminder not of tyranny or failure, but of fragility. Even the greatest empires are not immune to the judgments of narrative. Even the most powerful men can disappear when their truth becomes inconvenient. And even the son of a legend can become a footnote if his life refuses to conform to myth. Yet the past, no matter how buried, never disappears entirely. It lingers, in the scars of stone, in the margins of scrolls, in the questions that still have no answers. Cambyses II, once the king of kings, remains not in triumph, but in trace. His life was not a fable, nor a caution, but a truth too complex for monuments. And that is why we remember him now, not to judge but to restore, to speak, at last, the name that history tried to forget. There are kings whose names echo through the centuries like thunder, and there are others whose memory flickers quietly, like a torch behind a closed door. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, conqueror of Egypt, Shahanshah of the Achaemenid Empire, belonged to both. For more than 2,000 years, he remained a paradox, a ruler cast in bronze by power, yet rendered invisible by history. A name that once commanded a continent, later confined to the margins of empire. And yet, in that silence, his legacy endured. Not in the form of grand inscriptions or temples bearing his name, but in the deeper patterns of history, where the movements of power, fear, and inheritance leave their mark long after statues crumble. Cambyses' reign, brief and tumultuous, left behind no monolithic narrative. Instead, it became a battlefield of perspectives. Herodotus vivid but suspect accusations, Darius calculated edits, the lost voices of Egyptian scribes, and the overlooked testimonies of soldiers and satraps. Each offered a sliver of truth, but no single one defined him completely. To understand Cambyses is not to read one account. It is to read between them, to peer into the fissures where memory has cracked. What remains clear, however, is the sheer scale of the empire he helped shape. By the end of his reign, the Achaemenid domain stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Nile in the west. He had completed what Cyrus began, the unification of the ancient world's greatest civilizations under a single banner. The conquest of Egypt was not merely a military achievement, it was the culmination of a vision, that east and west, Mesopotamia and the Nile, Zoroastrian fire and Egyptian stone, could be bound by law and administration. For all his faults, and there were many, Cambyses had not been a careless ruler. He preserved local customs, honored native administrators when he could, maintained roads and tribute systems, and expanded imperial infrastructure. His reforms continued long after his death. His logistical strategies, such as the use of Arabian tribes for desert crossings, became standard military doctrine. And his willingness to command across cultures laid the groundwork for later emperors, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, who inherited not only the crown, but the challenge of holding such vastness together. Cambyses, though erased in iconography, was not erased in structure. His empire survived him, and that, perhaps, is a deeper legacy than stone. In Egypt, his name was struck from inscriptions, and temples refused to list him among the pharaohs. Yet even there, archaeology tells a different story. In Memphis and Saqqara, fragments of inscriptions show that he funded temple maintenance, respected economic structures, and even employed Egyptian priests as officials. The infamous tale of the Apis bull's desecration, once paraded as proof of his insanity, has been questioned by modern historians. Evidence suggests the Apis cult continued uninterrupted during his rule, and that Cambyses may even have made offerings in accordance with tradition. So what then was true? Was he a madman, as Herodotus claimed, raving in Egypt, killing his own family, and laughing at the gods? Or was he a cold, burdened ruler, pressured by the legacy of a mythic father, consumed by suspicion, trapped between two incompatible worlds? Most likely he was both and neither. What can be said with confidence is this: Cambyses was a man formed in the fire of expectation. He was taught from birth to be Cyrus' son, not merely in blood, but in glory. And when the world failed to embrace him as it had embraced Cyrus, he hardened. His paranoia was not born from nothing. It was forged in a court where rivals whispered, satraps plotted, and brothers became threats. He became distant because he was isolated. He ruled with severity because he sensed that mercy would be mistaken for weakness. He silenced dissent because he feared that voices, once unleashed, would dethrone him. And in doing so, he created the very fear that would erase him. But Cambyses was also a visionary. He imagined an empire that touched the Mediterranean, the Nile, the Persian Gulf, and the steppes of Central Asia. He believed it could be administered not through endless conquest, but through systems and laws. He appointed governors across ethnic lines, streamlined tax collection, and tried to act not just as conqueror but as steward. He failed, not because the idea was wrong, but because he lacked the time, the temperament, and the trust to see it through. And yet, history is rarely fair. The kings who win are remembered as brilliant. The kings who lose are remembered as mad. Cambyses did both, and so he became forgotten. Darius, needing a clean beginning, had no use for a complicated predecessor. Cambyses was buried beneath layers of propaganda, too royal to be condemned, too flawed to be celebrated. He became a negative space in the Achaemenid story, a caution whispered to future kings. But centuries later, the sands began to shift. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered Persian records, Babylonian chronicles, and Egyptian inscriptions that complicated the Greek stories. They discovered temple ledgers that listed Cambyses' donations, administrative documents bearing his seal, and references that hinted at a more nuanced figure than the mad king of Herodotus' imagination. Slowly, a restoration began, not of Cambyses' power, but of his humanity. Modern historians now see him not as an outlier, but as a product of his time. A man at the crossroads of cultures, tasked with holding an empire together across vast and diverse regions. A man raised to rule, but left unequipped for the emotional toll it exacted. A ruler whose paranoia was both cause and consequence. A man who tried to be greater than himself and collapsed beneath the weight. And in this, Cambyses speaks not just to antiquity but to today. His story reminds us that power without clarity breeds fear. That silence, though it may hide mistakes, cannot erase them. that to inherit greatness is not the same as to understand it, and that, sometimes, the most profound lessons lie not in what empires build, but in whom they forget. As the sun sets over the ruins of Persepolis, where broken columns rise like ribs of a fallen titan, there is no statue of Cambyses, but in the wind, among the dust and stone, his legacy lingers, unspoken but undeniable. He was the son of a godlike father. He was the ruler of the world's greatest empire. He was the pharaoh of a land that never accepted him. He was the king who fought not only armies but shadows. And though his name was buried, and his face never carved into relief, he endures. In the margins, in the questions, in the silence, Cambyses II, forgotten king, conquered conqueror, erased but never gone.